Well, Paul, thank you so much for coming on to chat with me about your fantastic book. And I want to thank Pegasus for sending it, Awakening the Spirit of America, FDR's War of Words with Charles Lindbergh, and the Battle to Save Democracy. I read it in 2 days, which means it's really a great piece of writing. So thank you for being here to chat about it.
Well, thank you, John, for having me on. And I'm glad you enjoyed the book.
Yes, I really did. I've already been telling other people in my family it's going to be heading their way next, and don't mind the underlining through the book.
You could always buy him another book.
Hey, I could, yeah, I could do that. And they're in the States, and I'm in Canada, so maybe it'll be easier just to buy them a book and have it sent down there.
Great.
So, but I really want to dive deep into the book as we move forward through our conversation. But your background, Paul, is really interesting to me because I'm trained at the graduate level as a public historian. And you've done a tremendous amount of work in the public history field. And I would love to chat with you about that because I know that many of my listeners are also interested or work within the public history sphere. So could you give us a little bit of background, Paul, about your educational background and how you got involved in history in general?
Well, it's a bit of an unusual pathway. In college, I was a music major. I lived in California, went to UC Santa Cruz, long-haired hippie playing electronic music. I did my master's program in electronic music and recording media. And for some reason, couldn't find a job. So I got involved in doing sound recording for documentaries and eventually worked in television as an editor and then a producer. It's been about 20 years in television doing magazine shows and news programs and a lot of documentaries, won a couple Emmys, met a lot of really interesting people, traveled the world. It was fascinating. And then when my daughter was born, I said, 70-hour work weeks, traveling all the time. I think I'm looking for something different. And I went to work for the Newseum, which was a big museum in Washington, D.C., looking at the history of journalism and the First Amendment, where I really got deeply involved in this idea around public history. And because of the broad scope of a term like journalism or the First Amendment or freedom of expression, we covered a lot of different territories. We produced over 100 documentaries that were interactives. We interviewed all of the Pulitzer Prize winning photographers, for example, and explored how they captured these moments that are so resonant with us in time. And then when the opportunity arose to become the director of the FDR Library, I said, that's just like the perfect job for me. And I went up there. I had worked with the National Archives for a number of years in my capacity as a producer and a filmmaker. And so I was familiar with them. But the nature of a presidential archive is a very different thing. And it was really remarkable to me, sort of the vision that FDR had to create the first federal presidential library, where he gave all of his papers and a lot of his personal possessions to the American people to be maintained and preserved by the National Archives. And so in that period, I really was able to delve deeply into the Roosevelt era. And in it, I was sort of just astounded by his persuasive use of language, how he was able to accomplish so much, and specifically the way he used language and the way he used media, radio, newspapers, magazines, to change American public opinion. And it really was a deeply satisfying experience.
Did your perception of FDR change at all? Did you learn something new about him that made you respect him more, or maybe even less, dare I say, from the time that you got there to the time that you left? Was there something that really made you think differently about FDR in general?
Yes. I mean, obviously, when you immerse yourself in a subject matter like this, and during the most, critical period in American history, mid-20th century, the Great Depression, World War II, Eleanor Roosevelt, they birthed the Civil Rights Movement, all of the issues that were going on in that mid-20th century period. There were two things that I would say really were astonishing to me. And one was this extraordinary ability FDR had to connect with the American people. I mean, all successful politicians have, charisma and the ability to connect with people. But when you think about what he did when he became president of the United States, it was, 3 years into the worst economic crisis in our history, the Great Depression. People today just don't understand how terrible it was. 25% unemployment, 6 million people homeless, jobs cratering. Almost everyone took a pay cut. There were bread lines. People were literally living in the streets. And the federal government had no role to play in helping people. That was expected to be done by the churches or the states or the communities. And of course, they were all overwhelmed. And when he took office on March 4th, 1933, we were at the peak of the banking crisis. 1,000 banks had been forced to close in the month before he took office. And of course, there was no federal deposit insurance. He was the one who created that. So if your money was in the bank and the bank closed, you lost everything. People lost their farms, their homes, their life savings. And so the first thing he did was declare a bank holiday. It's a lovely positive term, but really he closed every bank in America. Banks were closed for 12 days. And on the night before they were to reopen, he delivered his first radio fireside chat. Now, he had reconvened Congress and they'd passed this Emergency Banking Act, but it was a Sunday night and the banks were going to reopen the next morning. And of course, the question was, when they reopen, are people going to rush the banks again, line up outside, riot to get their money out, or are they going to have a renewed faith in the banking system? And in a 13-minute fireside chat in which FDR basically explains what the new rules are, what they're trying to do to define what are the healthy banks, what are the struggling banks, and what are the banks that really are not able to reopen. And he said in what I think is just a sort of brilliant turn of phrase, your money is safer in a reopened bank than it is under your mattress. And why is that an effective term? Because people literally had put their money under their mattresses when they pulled it out of the bank because they had no place else to put it. And so Monday morning, when the banks reopened, thousands of people were lined up. And in fact, they were bringing their money back to the banks. And although nothing had fundamentally changed in the American economy other than this Emergency Banking Act, but he had ended the banking crisis because he had instilled in the American public faith. In his famous inaugural address, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He's talking about the banking crisis. And so he was able to persuade the American public that they had nothing to fear, that the banking crisis was solvable and that we were going to get back on our feet and your money was safe. And so to me, that was the sort of extraordinary example of his persuasive ability and this ability to communicate with the American public, tell them what they need, and show them a path forward. One of the things that surprised me a lot about FDR was that he used a lot of biblical references in his speeches. So I read almost all of his speeches, multiple drafts. The FDR library has what they call the master speech file, in which all of the drafts of all of the speeches are there with all of the edits and all the changes. Interestingly enough, in that first inaugural address, the line, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, does not show up into the seventh, the next to the last draft before that line appears. So I think, because, 90+% of Americans at that point went to church. They were Christian and they identified as Christian and they went to church. And so he would use the parables, the biblical stories, not for religious purposes. He almost never referred to Jesus Christ or evangelically trying to convince people to be Christians, but more a framework for behavior. How should you act? How does the Bible say you should treat your neighbors? How does the Bible say you should treat immigrants, right? How does the Bible address the issues of income inequality? And so he used it in a very effective way because it was a common language that, of course, today, a much, much smaller percentage of people actually go to church and understand the Christian doctrine.
Were there people who basically got a lot of media coverage at that time, other than Charles Lindbergh, who were outspoken critics of FDR, who he had they were a little thorn in his side for a while pre the Lindbergh time that you talk about in the book?
Well, of course. I mean, there was Father Coughlin, who was a Roman Catholic priest, and he had a massive radio following, and he spewed this vile anti-Semitic attacks and smears. He was very anti-Roosevelt, And he was just one of a number of radio broadcasters at that time. Of course, you had Hitler and Mussolini, who were also using radio very effectively overseas. A little bit earlier, you had Huey Long out of Louisiana, who was this radically populist politician. And so, yes, he had a lot of competition for the airwaves. And of course, many of the owners of big media opposed FDR's policies. So when Lindbergh came along, you had people like William Randolph Hearst with the largest, newspaper empire in America. You had Colonel Robert McCormick, who owned the Chicago Tribune and WGN radio station, the most powerful radio station in the country that covered almost the entire Midwest. And you had other politicians who were deeply involved in a conservative/right-wing effort to undermine Roosevelt's administration and to attack him. So that there were very powerful forces aligned against him before Lindbergh sort of reemerged on the scene in 1939.
How did that acceleration happen, Paul, when the war began in Europe? How did the mood change, or it was amplified by media? How did that all come about, where now we're going to a different level of dissent, if you will, at least in speech, with FDR's policies?
Well, World War I had left a real bitter taste in Americans' mouth. The stench of World War I was still hung on the body politic because, England and France had not repaid the money we had lent them in World War I because of the onerous penalties put on Germany. Germany had economically collapsed before Hitler had come in and instituted the fascist regime. And so most Americans didn't want to get involved in another European war. They thought that this was really just a continuation of this battle between European countries that they didn't want to get involved with. And FDR, on the other hand, saw Hitler specifically as an existential threat to democracy. He believed Hitler when he said he wanted to create a 1,000-year Reich. He wanted world domination. He wanted to kill all the Jews in Europe. And FDR believed him when other people said, oh, he's just saying that, he doesn't really think that. And in fact, when Mein Kampf was first published in the United States in 1932, in the English version, the publishers had edited it. And they'd edited out a lot of the anti-Semitic stuff. And in the front piece, FDR was a book collector. And in the very front of the first English translation, he wrote, quote, "This book has been so heavily expurgated as to not accurately reflect the original," because he'd read the original in German. So he understood the threat that Hitler posed, whereas most Americans did not. Matter of fact, many Americans saw Germany as a success story. While America had suffered through the Depression and was still, even in 1939, not fully recovered, Germany seemed to be this dynamic economy. They were moving forward. They seemed to have solved the problems. And Lindbergh particularly felt this way. He lived in Europe and England for a number of years after his child was kidnapped and murdered to get away from the American press. Because he was the world's expert on aviation, all these countries would say, hey, come fly our plane, see what we're doing. So he went to England and France and Italy and Russia and Germany, and he flew all their planes. And he saw the Germans as having by far the most advanced aviation technology, the most dynamic economy. He loved the rigor and the order and the discipline that he saw in Germany. And he saw France and England as these decadent old, monarchies and democracies that were failing to keep up with the time. So, when he came back to the United States in April 1939, he had a very pro-German attitude. And then, of course, when the war starts in September of 1939, he feels like it's a mistake for America to come into the war on the side of England and France. And so he really decides he has to come forward and take a stand as an isolationist.
How does Lindbergh get involved with the America First entity?
So, he first starts doing these radio broadcasts. And again, he left America in 1935. He hated the press. He hadn't done any press at all for years. And then just 2 weeks after Germany invades Poland, just 10 days after FDR gives his first fireside chat about the war, Lindbergh comes out and says we shouldn't get involved in this war. Now, the America First movement doesn't get started till slightly later in 1940, and it actually starts on the campus of Yale University with a number of students, not unlike the 1960s anti-war movement on American campuses against the Vietnam War. But they decided they needed a bigger, organization, and they turned to the person who was the CEO of Sears and Roebuck Company to become their CEO. And then they started trying to bring together all these different isolationist forces. And they reached out to Lindbergh right away, and Lindbergh sort of helped make some connections, but he didn't want to be tied down. He didn't want to be a part of this organization. He wanted freedom to speak for himself, to speak in his own terms, to set his own agenda. So it really wasn't until later in 1941 that Lindbergh finally decides that it's so critically important that they stop Roosevelt, that they need to bring all of these isolationist groups together under the America First banner. And that's when he becomes the spokesperson for America First. And again, he had powerful allies, William Randolph Hearst, Colonel McCormick, and of course, Henry Ford, a vicious anti-Semite, and who had factories in Germany and believed very strongly that, we should be supporting Germany, not England and France.
This a lot of the anger, it seemed like, stemmed from Roosevelt's ideas of Lend-Lease and cash and carry to try to help out with Britain, who's now standing alone by 1940. They're pretty much by themselves now, and it seems like Roosevelt is like, I have to help Churchill any way I can because that's the last bastion of hope that we have in this conflict. He's taking a side in a way, but at the same time, he's trying to be politically savvy about it because he is FDR.
Exactly right. And the Congress had passed these series of what they called the Neutrality Acts, which after World War I, because they didn't want to they were specifically designed to prevent America from getting involved in foreign wars. So we're not allowed to sell weapons or supplies to belligerent countries. Our ships aren't allowed to go into the ports of belligerent nations, nations that are involved in a conflict. There were very strict regulations that FDR had to gradually work towards having them loosened for him to do what he wants to do. But I also, in September 1939, when World War II starts in Poland, 70% of Americans don't want to get involved in this war. So a vast majority of Americans are opposed to any involvement by the United States in this foreign war. And so Lindbergh is really speaking for that silent majority of people who don't want to get involved. So FDR has to both work through Congress and loosen up these restrictions imposed on him by the Neutrality Acts, and at the same time shift public opinion. And this is what my book is really about, is this how he goes about this process through language, through speeches, through his actions to convince the American public that we have a moral obligation to help fight for freedom. He calls it the spirit of America. That's why the title, Awakening the Spirit of America. He believes that our core value is that we, as a founding nation, our core value is we're willing to fight for freedom, right? That's how strongly we believe it. We are willing to fight and die for freedom. And that if we're willing to fight and die for freedom for ourselves, we should be willing to fight to defend freedom for people everywhere, especially when the forces of oppression are fascist with a goal of world domination, which pose an existential threat to American democracy. So those were big ideas that had to be very gently provided to the American public so they shift their point of view. And of course, Lindbergh and the other isolationists felt the exact opposite, that we don't want to get involved in this war. It has nothing to do with us. We're perfectly safe. We've got two oceans. No one can bother us. We should just let them fight it out over there and not pay any attention.
What was that partnership like between Roosevelt and Churchill? It almost seems like some people say it was almost like a brotherhood, and some people say it was just the political necessity, and that's why they were close. Was there something to either one of those things, or was it a little bit of both?
Well, to go back with your earlier question, I think what I learned most about FDR was this extraordinary relationship he had with Winston Churchill. I mean, it's unprecedented in American history and probably in world history that you had two leaders of these nations that would cooperate and collaborate as much as they did. So in World War I, Churchill was the First Lord of the Admiralty for the British, and FDR was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So they'd had somewhat similar positions, and they both strongly believed in the importance of a powerful Navy. And then Churchill has a falling out. He's basically kicked out of government for a long time. And then when Germany invades Poland, they bring Churchill back in as First Lord of the Admiralty. Now, FDR hated the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. So when Churchill comes back into the government, first thing FDR does is send him this private personal letter saying, hey, since we had similar jobs in World War I, let's open up a line of communication. Is there anything you need? Please contact me directly, either using your pouch or mine. Now, you can just imagine this is a gross violation of political and diplomatic protocol for the President of the United States to be contacting a military officer in another country involved in a war in which we are officially neutral. Mm-hmm. So Churchill goes to the Prime Minister and says, hey, I got this letter from the President. We should probably answer it. And so they draft a letter. He sends the letter back to FDR. And he basically says, yes, let's open up this line of communication. And he signs it naval person because he's acting in his official capacity. Then in May of 1940, when he becomes Prime Minister, he begins signing these messages back and forth, former naval person. And there's more than 2,000 communications back and forth between the two of them during this period, during the war. They're all kept in what they call the map room files at the FDR library, which are extraordinary. And you go through these things and it's amazing, their communications back and forth. They were actually together 113 days during World War II, believe it or not, in conferences and in meetings and things. And they communicated by telephone once they got a secure line set up between England and the United States. So it was an extraordinary friendship. And it was a complicated one, which shifted over time. So in the beginning, obviously, Churchill is the war leader because England is involved in this war. The British Empire is involved in this war, and America is not. After Pearl Harbor, when FDR finally becomes the leader of an allied nation, Churchill and the British are still the dominant military force. But fairly quickly, as America ramps up, you have more and more American military equipment, more and more American soldiers and sailors and naval units out there. And the balance of power shifts from Churchill to Roosevelt. And by the Big Three Conference in 1943, Roosevelt really has emerged now as the leader of the Allied forces. And it's difficult for Churchill to swallow that. But, after the Casablanca conference, Churchill goes to the airport to see FDR off. And as FDR is taking off, Churchill turns to his aide and says, that's the greatest man who ever lived. I don't know what I would do without him. So, it was a really unique and important relationship. And if it had gone a different way, who knows what would have happened in World War II.
A lot of us have seen the videos of the rallies in Madison Square Garden and other places that the America First and the Isolationists put on right before the war begins for the United States, at least. And I've often wondered, what happened to their mindset after Pearl Harbor, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, because it seems like these people just kind of go into the abyss and they're gone. They're just back into society and it's business as usual. And now we're coming together and trying to help with the war effort, or is it something else? And it was really interesting to me in your book about Lindbergh and how he kind of sees the writing on the wall after the attack on Pearl Harbor, which, by the way, I really appreciate the fact that you pointed out that Roosevelt is also shocked by the attack on Pearl Harbor because there's a myth out there that he was hoping to be attacked at Pearl, and it's like, no, he was not hoping for that. He knew there might be something going on, but he didn't know. And I've often wondered about those people, though, who were at the America First rallies or the isolationists after Pearl and the attack in December of 41. What happened to their mindset, or how did that change their life? And you really point that out very well with Lindbergh. And I'm wondering what you thought of that when you saw that come out of him, where he suddenly decides something else because the nation has changed now, or the situation has changed.
So there's really two different factions in the isolationist movement. There are people who are sincerely isolationist and don't think the United States should get involved in a foreign war, but they don't particularly like Hitler. And then there are the people who are pro-Nazi, pro-fascist, pro-Hitler, anti-British, and anti-Semitic. And so the two groups respond differently to Pearl Harbor. So Lindbergh, a few days after Pearl Harbor, comes out and makes a public statement saying, the United States has been attacked by force of arms, and by force of arms, we must respond. However we feel about our leadership that has led us to this point, and there's a little dig at FDR, we must now all come together to defend the United States. But of course, he announces that America First will be shutting down. Behind the scenes, America First shuts down publicly, but the pro-Nazi anti-Semitic group goes underground and continues. And they resurface sort of after the war as part of the McCarthy-esque anti-communist witch hunt, hunting down American subversives. And so they don't ever really go away. And there's even a thread of that sort of American fascist anti-Semitic movement that you see today. But Lindbergh, because he had sort of burned all his bridges in Washington, when you take on the president of the United States repeatedly, and take a stand, pro anti-Semitic activity and pro Hitler, it's hard to then go back and tell the, military leaders that, hey, I want my old job back as a lieutenant colonel in the Air Corps. And so he couldn't get a job with any of the official U.S. Military branches, despite the fact being one of the great aviation experts in the world. But Henry Ford did hire him to come and work at his plant in Willow Run, which was building B-24 bombers. And Lindbergh did really help improve. It was not a particularly well-designed plane. The factory had a lot of quality control issues, and he came in and really helped that. And then later on in the war, he essentially becomes a private consultant and goes through the company that's making the fighter planes that the Marines are flying in the Pacific. And he goes and he helps improve the performance of those fighter planes, improves their range, improves their fuel efficiency, improves their maneuverability, and it ends up flying 50 combat missions as a private citizen in we should just say, unsanctioned role in the Pacific. And so, he redeems himself in many ways as a pilot. After the war, when Eisenhower is elected president, Eisenhower reinstates his official rank as a lieutenant general in what's now the U.S. Air Force, and he's sort of redeemed, and people tend to push aside the legacy of his fascist support, and he goes back to being a sort of young American hero who flew across the Atlantic, and it's surprising how few people today know that he was a pro-Nazi anti-Semite.
It is really interesting, Paul, because I was at the Air and Space Museum with my wife, and we were walking around, and I saw this huge display for Charles Lindbergh. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And I walked over to it, and I was telling her about some of his theories on should we be involved in the Second World War and et cetera, and America First and isolationism. And she said, I've never heard of this. And I said, well, I didn't hear about it in school. I had to, that was something we heard about outside of school. We only heard about the Spirit of St. Louis. And it really shows that memory still remains with a lot of people. They just think of him as the Spirit of St. Louis and this great aviator, which he was a great aviator. But they forget sometimes, or it was kind of pushed aside about this isolationist legacy and some anti-Semitic troops that he used. And I don't know what the theory might be on that, Paul, but it's kind of interesting to think that historical memory is always evolving. And it's interesting to think of that with Lindbergh, because a lot of people I've talked to didn't know this about him.
Well, again, it's important to understand the context of the time. A majority of Congress were pro-German and isolationist. And in fact, there was a Nazi agent, a guy named George Sylvester Viereck, who was writing Nazi propaganda as speeches and giving them to congressmen and senators, who were then delivering these speeches on the floor, and then using their franking privileges to send this Nazi propaganda out to their unsuspecting constituents, as a way of undermining Roosevelt and to turn public opinion against England and towards Germany. It's very, very similar to what we're seeing happening right now with Russia, where Russia is trying to undermine American support for Ukraine using social media and using people that appear to be Americans but are actually paid Russian agents. They were doing the exact same thing back then. And I think that at the end of the war, there were 22 congressmen and senators who were indicted for being unregistered foreign agents during the war, working for the German government. None of them were convicted for a long and complicated set of reasons, although several of their staff were convicted and went to prison. And at the end of the war, remember, within a year or two, Germany's not the enemy anymore. Russia's the enemy now. And so a lot of the pro-German, pro-Hitler, pro-Nazi sentiments that came up during the war are sort of buried. And now we have a new enemy to worry about, the Russians. And so there's a lot of airbrushing that happened for a lot of people, particularly politicians, whose openly pro-Nazi, isolationist points of view were well documented, who sort of just brush it off. And at the end of the war, now we're all against the Russians. So history has a funny way of airbrushing things it doesn't like out.
It really does. It really does. Paul, I thank you so much for your time and talking about the book, Awakening the Spirit of America. Like I said, it was a fantastic read. And I'll buy a copy for my family back in the United States. And I really appreciate your time. And I wish the best for you in the future with maybe another book.
Well, keep up the great work. It's a great podcast. And I think what you're doing, in this area of public history is vitally important. Schools are not teaching history the way they should. And so much of this has to happen after the fact. And these kinds of engaging conversations, I think, are vitally important for people to get different perspectives on how we got where we are today.
Well, thank you, Paul.
Thank you, John.